All right, welcome everybody to our panel today, Diversity in Sports. My name is Dr. JAMIL NORTHCUTT. I'm currently the Assistant Athletic Director for Internal Operations in our Athletic Department, and I also serve as an adjunct faculty instructor in the Department of Higher Education. Today we want to have a great discussion, great dialogue. We got some distinguished guests here with us, and we'll just go ahead and get started. So panelists, I don't want to introduce you personally, but I want you guys to take the time to introduce yourselves. And so starting here with Dr. Bartee, if you don't mind introducing yourselves, talk about what area that you work in on campus, also talk about your research interests and your career path a little bit for us.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much, Dr. Northcliffe, for having me as a part of this distinguished panel of professionals in the field. My name is ROSUSAN BARTEE, and I'm currently a professor and program coordinator of educational leadership in the School of Education. I am I'm actually a former athlete, interestingly enough. And as I was preparing for the discussion today, it took me back to those days of high school some years ago. But notwithstanding, when I went to college, I decided to abandon that part of me and pursue academics. And from there at Tougaloo College with a BA in English, I moved to Northwestern University where I received my master's there and the PhD in educational policy studies from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And while there, after studying areas of cultural and social capital, I discovered my passion for research. And that particular line of research would follow me to this point here as Professor of Educational Leadership. I've worked at the national policy level with the National Council for Teacher Education and Accreditation, as well as the Frederick Patterson Research Institute of the United Negro College Fund. So I'm so happy to be here, and we'll get to talk more about some of those career pathway options.
I'm James Thomas. I'm an assistant professor of sociology here at the University of Mississippi. I too am also a former college athlete. I was a walk-on football player for the University of Missouri for 2 years. My research interests currently are in how the concept of diversity becomes absorbed by institutions and how members of those institutions at various levels, how they make meaning out of diversity, how they engage with it, how they do diversity work. So for institutions of higher ed, for instance, I'm really interested in how diversity is interpreted by both students, staff, faculty, and administrators, how it's interpreted differently and how it's practiced differently because of that.
I'm Chuck Ross, Director of the African American Studies Program, Associate Professor of History and African American Studies. I was one of the best pickup basketball players in the history of my high school, I guess. Played high school basketball, and played high school football 1 year. I work on African Americans and really pro football. I've done a book looking at the history of African Americans in pro football from 1904 to 1962. And I currently am working on another book that is looking at African Americans, television, and the American Football League. And I have been just between my administrative responsibilities and teaching students, like a couple of my students over here, and doing this kind of stuff, trying to find times to write. So beyond that, that's what my area is, I guess, and why I'm on this panel.
My name is Doug Davis. I'm actually Dr. Bartee's colleague in the K-12 Leadership Program in the School of Education. I'm an associate professor there. I became involved in Dr. Northcutt's research when he was a student in the qualitative research methods class that I teach. And I was very interested in this topic, although it's not directly in my line of research. But I have a kind of a long background in this, and part of it's family. My father was actually very involved in the drafting of Title IX legislation back in the 1970s. He had a long career in higher education as an administrator, and in that role he was highly involved with intercollegiate athletics and issues of race in intercollegiate athletics. So there were a lot of dinner conversations. My father ended his career in higher education in 1996 when he retired as chancellor at LSU. So just the only reason to say that is that hopefully you can see the connection and the role in higher education. Also, I have a long background in research and looking at issues of race in K-12 education. As an educator working to improve conditions in education across the South, that's very much a part of those issues, including issues of what happens in higher education and what happens in intercollegiate athletics. My dissertation at LSU was an oral history of the experiences of teachers during the desegregation of Baton Rouge public schools. So I was very honored when Dr. Northcutt asked me to serve on this panel, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
I'm Samuel Friedman, and I'm a professor of journalism at Columbia University in New York. I write a column every other week for the New York Times about religion, but the main reason I'm here is in the third part of my life, which is as a book author. And my most recent book, called Breaking the Line, is a narrative history of the role that African American coaches and student athletes played in the civil rights movement, and looking particularly at the 1967 football season at Grambling State University and Florida A&M University, two great rivals on the field that played for the Black College Championship that year, and how during the course of that season, the coach at Grambling, Eddie Robinson, was developing the player who'd become the first African American to really break through as a starting quarterback in the NFL, James Harris, and all the reasons it was so particularly difficult. There was so much opposition for a black to play that position above all others. And then meanwhile at Florida A&M, the coach there, Jake Gaither, was working behind the scenes doing the necessary political lobbying and persuasion to gain permission from the state of Florida to play what would be the first college football game ever in the South between a black college football team and a white or integrated college football team. And that also propelled that game, which was played in 1969, drastically hastened the pace of the recruiting of African American student athletes by previously all white schools, particularly in the SEC and ACC, and also began the process of making integrated college football games normal.
Well, awesome. Well, hopefully you guys are hungry for some more information. This panel is definitely esteemed and distinguished. So obviously diversity and inclusion, we hear that this catchphrase all the time going on. Can you guys define what that is to you?
Oh, did we just start?
Yeah, somebody just please jump in and take that question.
All right, well, I'm going to start it, and I expect my colleagues to finish it. I see diversity as something that encompasses both acceptance and respect, in the sense that we have to be mindful that differences do exist among all of us. And those differences are ones that cannot be treated as deficits. Differences cannot be treated as deficits. And far too often that happens in terms of when we see perspectives that may not mirror our own. And essentially we start to marginalize or ostracize those perspectives in ways that devalue the individuals at play. Now what's interesting about that concept too is that not only do we need to respect it and accept it, but also we have to be able to create a context where an exploration of those differences can occur. It's simply about understanding each other, the backgrounds that all of us bring, and recognizing that there are distinctions within those backgrounds that should not be demarginalized, that should not be put in a place where people feel unsafe, people feel afraid to exist in their own skin. And so that's where I'm going to start. I'll let my colleagues continue on in terms of this diversity thing.
Thanks.
Well, so I'll probably have a bit of a different take maybe, given that I'm really interested in how people make meaning out of this term. And so for me, when I hear the words diversity and inclusion, I think about them as part of this larger shift in language, particularly in higher ed, also in college athletics, that is part of the corporatization of the university. In other words, diversity has a commercial value. It can be used as a way of marketing the university. It can also be used as a way of transforming the university and college athletics into a marketplace. So in this sense, if you take sort of a more critical approach to the term diversity and also its bedfellow inclusion, in many ways, they're practices that actually help to mask underlying inequalities. By focusing on the selling of the term diversity and the marketing of the term diversity, the focus becomes about changing the perception of a place versus actually making transformative changes to the place.
Oh, I would say, I think we all have an understanding of kind of diversity and inclusion. I think, in essence, it is basically a functional, or they're functional terms that indicate that we would like people of all shapes, backgrounds, colors, whatever the case may be, to have opportunities. I would prefer to look at it from a more pragmatic perspective. Richard Lapchick down at Central Florida puts out this report every year. Mm-hmm. And he has some very measurable things in terms of these words of diversity and inclusion. For example, do we have any African Americans that are athletic directors in the Southeastern Conference? Do we have any African Americans that are head football coaches in the Southeastern Conference? If we don't, why not? What things are being done to try to make these opportunities available? And so I think, for me, what we need to be more focused on is how do we achieve diversity and inclusion, particularly in the area of sports. I think that historically we have made progress on the field in terms of extending opportunities to individuals largely based around their skill set. Well, the challenge now is individuals that are in key decision-making situations, head coaches, general managers, athletic directors. At least in the National Football League at this point, they have created a policy that indicates that you must at least have some minority candidate in every pool when you get ready to try to hire a head football coach of these 32 teams in the National Football League. We don't have the same policy when you start talking about hiring a coach at the collegiate level in this country. And clearly we still have some vestiges of discrimination that make it more difficult for African American coaches to have these same opportunities as their white counterparts. And even we have some glaring situations, like at the University of Texas when Charlie Strong was hired, one of the key donors, key businessmen, question his ability to coach at this level. Here this man is coached at the University of Louisville. He's done everything. In fact, he's very late. If he was a white coach, he would have had a job like this well before, several years before this opportunity that he got at the University of Texas. And so my take on diversity and inclusion is, what are we doing to make it happen? What are we doing as a society to make sure we understand that, what it is? The question is, how committed are we to it, and what are we willing to do to try to make these things a reality?
Did you want to put in first?
Go ahead and I'll follow.
Oh, okay. I didn't mean to cut the line. I'm the New Yorker around here, so I won't do this like we're on the subway. You go ahead and I'll finish up.
In thinking about my dissertation research and looking at school integration in faculties, it was one thing to do the systematic parts of it, which were necessary. But that was actually the easy part. A federal judge ordered that all the schools in East Baton Rouge Parish would have a certain range of racial makeup within the schools. And while that was quite tumultuous, again, it was the easy part. The harder part is, I believe, to work through some type of cultural integration that recognizes and accepts and doesn't diffuse the home cultures of the individuals coming into a group or an organization. And I think we've made great strides in the numerical sides of diversity, but it's the cultural aspects of it that we're most struggling with. And I think that's the value of these types of conversations, is how do we come to work in diverse cultures without marginalizing minority cultures.
To work off of several points made by the other panelists, the first thing to say, particularly at a session with the title of this one, is that sports has such a disproportionate cultural power in American society. If you want to talk about football specifically, as Dr. Ross was, football in the South, all the more so. It can be, we can debate whether it has too much or too little, but it is what it is. And that power can be used for ill in terms of diversity, as with the Richie Incognito situation with the Dolphins, or it can be used in a very positive way to really point society in a better direction. I think one of the pregnant questions is why colleges have been slower than professional sports to come along. And I think 2 points were made earlier really speak to that. One is that the NFL has a diversity/affirmative action program. It's called the Rooney Rule, and Dr. Ross described it. Well, if you have a head coaching vacancy or a team executive, you must interview a racial minority, or now it can be a female candidate. And as I know from being on the task force about diversity with the Columbia University faculty, the thing you're constantly pushing against is this throwing up of the hands and saying, oh, we'd only hire a black or a Latino or a woman if we only knew of a qualified one, but we don't, so gee, too bad. What happens is when you look, you find. And that's been the experience in the NFL. And in some years, there have been as many as, I think, 7 or 8 African-American head coaches. There have been either an African-American head coach or general manager in 7 of the last 8 Super Bowls. So that is an effective part. It comes out of a successful affirmative action plan. And the other thing, this is where I might disagree with Dr. Thompson a little bit, is a place where commerce and pure capitalism actually works towards a social good. Teams in the NFL know they're running a business. They have to fill their stadium. They have to sell their skyboxes. They have to sell their merchandise. You know, they have to do all the things that let the football franchise be profitable. They can't indulge old ideas of racial inequality. They have to get the best person to be the coach, the best person to be the GM, the best person to play quarterback. And they've learned, it didn't come instantly or easily, but they've learned how to swallow some of the old prejudiced premises and go for that quality. And I think it's interesting that similarly, in the corporate sector, when you've seen affirmative action cases go to the Supreme Court lately, you've seen some of the, quote, conservative parts of our society, in quote marks, the military, big business, side in favor of keeping affirmative action, in favor of keeping diversity a factor, because it's good for business, but they also see it as a reflection of who their consumer base is. So I think the fact that it has a capitalist element doesn't disqualify it. With the colleges, as Dr. Ross was saying, the track record has really been dreadful. Right now, 55% of football players in the Football Bowl subdivision, that's all the conferences that can compete for the BCS championship, 55% of the players are African American, 9% of the head coaches. And 9% is the highest it's ever been. So there's a clear problem there, and there's a problem when you can see at the pro level, the amount of African American and Latino in terms of Ron Rivera coaching talent, and not see that being hired at the college level. And I think it goes to other forms of entrenched power and resistance. Alumni, boosters, as witnessed this fellow at Texas who disparaged Charlie Strong, said maybe he could be a good assistant coach. And also what we can call, by the euphemism, regional culture, or old folk ways that haven't really been shed yet. And it's created, I think, or allowed to perpetuate a dangerous dichotomy in which there's great African-American achievement on the field at the college level. There's not a commensurate rewarding of it with decision-making positions.
Well, the study by LabTech, it definitely highlights, it talked about Division I schools. Out of 365 of those schools, leadership positions of faculty athletic representatives, directors of athletics, and obviously presidents and chancellors of universities, 333 of those positions are held by Caucasians. And so you see the number disparity in those positions. So what do we do? Obviously, to change policy, and there's the NC2A body there. So what can we do in order to improve these conditions where we are?
Well, just one short answer, then I'll surrender it back. The NCAA needs its own version of the Rooney Rule, which is the diversity plan in the NFL.
No, I think I would agree with that. I think that's the first step, is that the NCAA, I mean, how can the NCAA not look at what is taking place in the National Football League when the NFL has decided that we're going to have a policy that you must at least interview one minority candidate for each opening? And what happened is that people like Mike Tomlin, as the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers, came in, and this is a person that probably would not be a head football coach in the National Football League. He comes into the interview, he's a young guy, he's 30-something years old, and immediately he impresses these individuals, and they give him this opportunity. If you don't have this rule in place, he doesn't get this opportunity to at least articulate what he thinks he can do with your particular football team. If you have that in place throughout the country, particularly in the conference that we're in the strongest conference in America. And as you alluded to, 55% of the individuals that are making this the strongest conference are African Americans. And let's be even more specific. The starters on these football teams, out of 22 people, you're probably talking 19, 20, 21 individuals that are African Americans that are in fact making all of the money and making these teams extremely successful. Now, in the 21st century, there have been African Americans in the SEC that are head coaches at Mississippi State. Who wants to coach at Mississippi State? How are you going to win at Mississippi State? You give this individual 3 years, you don't give him much patience. Okay, you give another individual an opportunity at the University of Kentucky. You don't give an individual an opportunity to be head football coach at the University of Alabama. You don't give him an opportunity to be head coach at Louisiana State or Tennessee, perennial teams, or Georgia that have all of these resources and have this long legacy of being successful. You give African American head coaches an opportunity at two of the worst teams in the Southeastern Conference. So to answer your question, it is very frustrating. I think it's even more frustrating for African Americans that are coaches, because put yourself in a situation that, okay, we want you to go out and recruit. You can be a position coach. You can be one of the key recruiting coordinators on our staff, but you're not going to be the offensive coordinator. You're not going to be the defensive coordinator. You're not going to be the individual that makes these key decisions, so that if the offense is doing well, you may have an opportunity now to get another job. And that's another issue that is underlying this real problem here, is that you have a lot of African Americans that are on these staffs that are asked to go out and recruit, but they are not, in many cases, having the same opportunity to be defensive coordinators and offensive coordinators on these football teams. And I can guarantee you, if you go to the SEC right now, you look, there are 14 teams, there are 9 full-time position coaches on every team. And what you're probably going to see, you're going to probably see anywhere from no less than 4, maybe as many as 5 African Americans that are coaches. Many of these individuals are keenly responsible for going out and doing the recruiting, bringing this 55 to 60%, bringing the majority of these key starters to our campus to represent your football team, but they are not coordinators and have this opportunity to be empowered in decision-making situations so that they may now move and become a head coach at a major school. Charlie Strong was a very, very unusual candidate, but you look at his career, coordinator at Florida, national championships, coordinator at South Carolina, finally gets an opportunity. He has to go to the University of Louisville. Nobody wants that job. He takes this job nobody wants. He wins to a point to where, hey, you got to give him an opportunity to go and be at another major school where you shouldn't have any problem winning. So it's very frustrating, I think, particularly not only for those players, because what does that say to a player that you're going to only have, there's a ceiling, okay, that is unwritten, that is very, very clear that, yeah, you can participate on the field, but once your career is over, do you have a chance to be the head football coach at the University of Mississippi? I'm not so sure.
I'd like to maybe push back on 2 points here. One, that a policy similar to the Rooney Rule would have an impact on diversity in college sports, and then 2, kind of talk about college sports more broadly and what diversity actually even means in that context. So when you look at the Rooney Rule and how it's been implemented, 2 former head football coaches who are African American, both Dennis Green and Ray Rhodes, have come forward and talked about how the Rooney Rule has functioned for them specifically. They became the token minority job candidates, so that for every NFL team that was going through a head coaching search, Ray Rhodes or Dennis Green would get the phone call, and they knew that when they went in, they were simply there to fulfill the role as the Rooney Rule obligation. So here, there's really no transformative change going on. You're just checking a box, right? And that diversity becomes a check box. The second point I want to push back on a little bit is comparing the NFL to the college system kind of highlights what I think is the absurdity of having a conversation about diversity when we can't have a conversation about inequity and inequality at the college level. When we talk about diversity at the college level, and let's put it in the context of coaching positions, for instance, and that if we somehow have a more diverse head coaching population or head coaching pool, that really doesn't change the nature of a college system that operates, and this is the sociologist in me, that operates through a coerced labor system. The difference between the college system and the NFL system is that players at the NFL are paid for the labor that they produce and the value they produce. Players in college are not. So whether you change roles at the head coaching position, it fundamentally doesn't change the exploitive nature of the system, at least on the college level.
So speaking of that, Dr. Bartee, obviously your area of expertise is in social capital, and talking about the experiences of student athletes, you know, and particularly African American student athletes or ethnic minorities, do they benefit the same by participating in sport? Obviously, we've talked about head coaching positions. We've talked about decision-making opportunities. Can you kind of talk about that and what you found in research or what you think about those subject matters?
Yes, I think it's a very interesting conversation going on here now, because actually I just got this invitation, a 25-year celebration of the Andrew Mellon Minority Undergraduate Research Association. And so what this particular organization does is that it focuses on building a pipeline of young people of color from their college years to the professorate. Because just as in higher education, there is a shortage of faculty of color, there is a shortage of coaches to assume positions as well. And so I think much of the conversation does need to be about building social capital. And how do we build a network or a cadre of individuals from the collegiate level to ensure that they have a pathway into Division I coaching positions? If you look at what capital is and what capital is not, capital obviously provides a form of resource to be able to exchange within this marketplace. So where you attend school does matter in terms of the kinds of jobs and positions that you will be able to have access to, just given what is considered to be legitimate or not legitimate. And so capital provides that sort of stamp of approval that you are okay to come and be part of Division I coaching squads. And so we have to prepare individuals to meet that kind of demand or to meet that kind of credentialing process through which a degree from a particular institution sort of certifies you as part of the club. There was an interesting study by Sean Hopper from the University of Pennsylvania entitled Black Male Student Athletes and Racial Inequalities in NCAA Division I College Sports. And he talks about this sort of phenomena that is occurring, and he says, quote, "Perhaps nowhere in higher education is the disenfranchisement of the black male student more insidious than in collegiate athletics." And so rightfully so, when he talked about the percentage levels of the graduation rates that minority or African-American male students are receiving in terms of their other male colleagues or comrades. And so we see a discrepancy there. So essentially, if you're coming to these campuses, as an African-American male athlete, you're not graduating at the same rate that other African-American males who are coming to the same campus are graduating. And so essentially, we have to begin to look at what does capital mean in terms of these individuals getting access to these kinds of institutions for which they want to be a part of. And I know that my affiliation with that organization that I started at Tougaloo College led to my pathway of being a professor here, because I went to the schools for which would be considered as acceptable for me to even be here. I'm not oblivious to that, but I understand too that we have to be strategic about how we pinpoint and place individuals in respective positions so that they can be ready to accept the call and move on into these positions. That's it.
I think that's a great point about building up the social capital and addressing the question also of graduation rates and what the expectation is for an African American, particularly male student athlete. In looking into the world of the HBCUs in the 1960s, on the one hand, it's an era of de facto segregation still being firmly in place. These schools then, like now, are underfunded, struggling, with resources, libraries, labs, faculty salaries in a way they can't possibly keep up with the, at that point, all white state universities. And yet the expectation for the student athletes there, for the football players, the ones I specifically wrote about, were to get a degree. Every one of those players, and I've met them now in their 70s and 80s and late 60s, to one they say, I knew that my football scholarship was about getting a degree. They were competitors, they wanted to get to the NFL if they could, but that was not seen as the goal. The goal was getting the diploma. And that sense of expectation and priority imbued them with the right value system from the start. And from the head coaches through the position coaches through everyone else, the understanding was you kept tabs on players, you made sure they were keeping up, you made sure they were going to class. If they weren't, you didn't pressure the professor to change the grade, you went to the student. And one of the sad paradoxes of the desegregation in what are now the FBS schools is that those expectations haven't been matched more often than not. Look, I've met, in traveling for about 6 months now, talking about my book, I've met plenty of exceptional examples of African American athletes who have excelled and gone on to degrees. There's a guy I met at the University of Georgia, sorry to mention one of your rivals, but a guy named Aaron White, who was their starting tight end and went to the combine, didn't make the pros, but he was already getting working towards his master's degree when he was a senior, when he was rather in his 4th year of eligibility, and he just got his MBA. So these stories do exist, but let's take it even out of the SEC so we don't regionalize it. At the University of Southern California, the graduation rate for an African-American football player is about 40%. It's 35% lower than the graduation rate for their white teammates or for the African-American student body in general. I refuse to believe that's about native ability. I firmly believe that's about expectations and priorities. And as someone who's been a professor for 25 years at Columbia and written a lot about education, I know that's key to any educational setting. What's the expectation put out for a student? It's also important, though, to recognize, as Dr. Thompson said, that the lives of student athletes at these large schools is to produce revenue for everyone but themselves. And so the question is, and this is something I've wrestled with, and I'll give you my answer in a moment, how can you serve two needs? How can you create a system that compensates the athletes who make money for the university, for ESPN, for sports talk radio stations, for Champion and Under Armour, for vendors, for everybody but themselves? How do they fairly get a piece of that, but not turn them just into paid mercenaries, not just make football at the FBS schools the minor leagues? Because when I went to college at the University of Wisconsin and lived in the dorm with football players and had football players in my classes and went to parties and you'd look up and see football players, it enriched my experience and I enriched their experience. And if you lose that and turn it just into the minor leagues, you've lost a precious opportunity. So we also have to recognize the time that it takes to be a varsity athlete in almost any sport, but let's talk about football. It makes it so hard to graduate in 4 years, no matter what your commitment level is. So a couple of suggestions have floated out there I think are worth talking about. Joe Nocera, one of my New York Times colleagues who's written a lot about the NCAA, says, let the standard athletic scholarship be good for 6 years, not just 4 years. At the end of the day, does it matter if someone gets their bachelor's degree in 6 rather than 4? Down the road, very little. What matters is you got the degree, and it accepts the reality of the time commitment that goes into the sport. And what I've written, you can find this, actually I wrote on ESPN.com last fall, is let's do 2 things. Let's work out a compensation system for student athletes. When your team is on national or regional TV, when your autograph is taken, when your jersey is sold, all those things, some cash value standardized by the NCAA is attached to it. But you don't get it right away. It sits in an escrow account for you, earning interest, and you get paid the day you get your bachelor's degree. So it incentivizes staying in school. It incentivizes being the student as well as the athlete. And I think then you're talking about both expectations and a realistic labor market as well, but using them not to perpetuate the idea that there's a big payday for everybody at the end, which is a tragic chimera for most student athletes, but incentivizing the work of getting the degree and everything that means for the rest of your life.
So when you talk
I think-
about, go ahead.
I think that's an excellent idea, but I would add, and based on your research, that the conditions, the normative conditions within which athletes come to university and experience college life need to be changed to support that kind of effort. Because right now there's issues with college athletes, they're not integrated into college student life. College athletes today are living in poverty when many of their co-students on especially the FBS schools have a good bit of wealth, and so there's a large disparity there that I think needs to be addressed. And then the counter narratives they get from within the athletic community of you're here to win football games, and then kind of the external narrative that, oh yeah, and you're here to get an education too. And requirements of how many credit hours that they need to take in during the football season. And I mean, for example, I don't see why students need to take any credit hours at all during football. Why not let them play the football season and then take courses during the spring and the summer? I mean, there are lots of things that could be done that will support the type of idea, but I really like the idea of incentivizing staying in school and finishing and getting the degree.
Let me just say one quick thing. As a historian, a lot of people don't remember, professional athletes used to have to work a second job.
They're off-season.
Baseball, football, they had to work another job. Because, you know why they had to work another job? Because they weren't paid at a rate that would sustain them throughout the year. And in this country, the only way that changed was that, particularly in Major League Baseball, it's the first strongest union in organized sports. Baseball players got organized, and they decided they wanted more money for being on the road, more money for signing with baseball cards. They wanted more money in salary. They didn't want to play all these day games. They formalized a union, and they began to now collectively bargain. Until college athletes do that, nowhere have you seen in the history of this country that is based on capitalism where the people that control all the resources say, you know what, we're going to start looking out for the little people. We're going to start now making it easier for you to stay in school. Stay in school 10 years and work on your degree. We're going to pay for it. We're going to look out for you. We have your interests at heart. Absolutely not. Until these athletes become organized and have the understanding that they control the resources. They control the system. Not the athletic directors, not the boosters, not the fans. If college football players across the country, the first game of the year, went out and sat down on the field and said, we are not going to play unless our demands are met, I guarantee you the NCAA would have everything off. ESPN would tell the NCAA, you know what, you get that fixed right away. You get that fixed right away. Whatever they want, I don't care what it is they want, you give it to them because we want these football games. We have paid you to have football. And so as long as these athletes are not organized, they're not going to have the benefit of support. They're not going to have these other kind of things because the reality is that they are labor and they are not being compensated. It is one of the most exploitive systems in the United States of America when you look at the amount of productivity that they are producing in terms of revenue and what they're being compensated in terms of a granted aid scholarship. It is one heck of a deal. Jerry Jones wouldn't want to do it. Jerry Jones would rather have this system than have to pay what he is paying DeMarcus Ware and Tony Romo. If you said, look, let's switch around and you have the same kind of dichotomy and pay your athletes what college athletes are paying, Jerry Jones would say, where can I sign up for?
No, I mean, he's exactly right. I mean, this is it's Taylor Branch, who's a civil rights attorney and activist, who appropriately called it a plantation system. And it is a plantation system. You have a demographic of college athletes who, through their labor, are producing these absurd amounts of revenue, tremendous amount of money. At the same time, the conditions of their athletic scholarship are a year-to-year basis. They can be dismissed at any point and for very vague reasons. They have very, very strict transfer rules so that you can't take your labor to somewhere else where perhaps you can negotiate for a better value. You're not even allowed to negotiate for your own value. Whereas coaches, who often have representation.
Absolutely.
Mac Brown signs a $5 million a year contract. You're absolutely right. He has an agent that's helping him negotiate that. Then you have prohibitions against representation, limits on due process, coupled with the failure to provide them the promise of an education. You pointed out graduation statistics. Florida State University, NCAA champion, 37% of their African-American male college athletes will graduate in a 6-year period. Not 4 years, 6 years. And all of the 6-year cohort studies that have been done recently, the average graduation rate for an African-American male football player across the country is just 50% over a 6-year period.
I think that's interesting. I wrote a quote here to get into the student-athlete right issues, but we've already dove full force into them. It's interesting because the first ever NCAA president and executive director made a statement in his memoir titled Unsportsmanlike Conduct. For those of you who don't know who that is, that's Walter Byers. He's got a lot of awards named after him at the NCAA. He said, the college player cannot sell his own feet. The coach does that. Nor can he sell his own name. The college will do that. This is the plantation mentality resurrected and blessed by today's campus executives. That's a statement by him in his memoir, Unsportsmanlike Conduct, in 1995 that he made. And if you want to look that up, that is on page 390 and page 391. But nonetheless, let's talk about these examples here. We talked about education. What impact has college athletics had on secondary education? Obviously, we've talked about post-secondary education, but what about secondary education? Why there's conversations out there that college athletics has damaged secondary education? Dr. Davis, can you touch on that?
Well, I'm trying to think what, I'm not sure in what ways.
Well, academic, let's look at academic preparation.
Well, I think certainly the college athletic system has put a much greater emphasis on high school athletics. And again, I'm not sure.
Let me help you. Let me see if I can help you.
All right.
Okay. All right, if we were to, for example, take everyone and we go to Oxford High School right now, we talk to everybody that's particularly black males between the 9th and 12th grade. And we say, where do you want to be when you get ready to get out of high school? What do you think they're going to start saying? There you go. I want to be a football player. I want to be a basketball player. The problem I think that we have right now with sports is that we don't have balance. Kids don't see me. They don't see JAMIL. They don't see average African-American males that are not athletes on television doing things relatively positive so that they can have some understanding. What is reinforced to them in particular, particularly African-American males, is the best way for you to be successful in society is to do something in the sports venue. Now, that's not necessarily the fault of sports. sports is capitalized off of that because there's a huge amount of money, there's commercials, and so you're bombarded with that. But if we could at least begin to have some balance, because the reality is that if we go to Lafayette High School, we go to Oxford High School, we go to South Panola High School, and we talk to all these kids, you're not going to the National Football League. You're not going to the NBA. And so you need to have much more realistic goals. And one of the easiest ways, I mean, you got a better chance of being a professor than Richard Sherman. And so the opportunity to study, prepare yourself, focus on a particular major, figure out where your strength is academically, get a college degree, go on to graduate school, and maybe get a job working at a university for 40 or 50 years. Maybe you can't make $2 or $3 million a year, but you also don't have to worry about your career ending after 4 or 5 years, or you being a coach and being fired, or whatever the case may be. So that's what the problem is, that we don't really have balance. And I think in the secondary schools, kids are not grounded in reality. They have a lot of peer pressure on them to set certain kind of standards, and also society pushes them into this idea that the best way for you to form your identity is that you must form it around athletics. And I think we really need to work on that.
You know, as a journalist and a journalism professor, I'd add that my profession is complicit in this. And part of what's happened with the advent of sports talk radio and sports cable is that coverage now goes to younger and younger echelons of sports. I was stunned a few years ago when one of my students at Columbia University pointed out to me that the Little League World Series is on ESPN. That kids, what's that, age 9 to 12 or 9 to 13, whatever it is, that's already a commodity in the entertainment marketplace. And by the time it's high school, it's it's the USA Today and other top 25 rankings in football and basketball. It's high school games being on ESPN and other sports cable network. It's all the websites that year-round track high school recruiting. And so why should it be surprising that high school kids themselves feel like they need to upload their highlight reels onto YouTube to get a scholarship? And all this coverage, you can be in high school and feel like you almost are a pro because your game's on TV just like the pro games are. You almost are in the SEC because your team is ranked, or there's a high school ranking the way there is for the top 25 top college football teams. I think it engenders that same terrible, tragic illusion that the future is going to be in sports, not in, maybe at best using sports as a way to get a college scholarship and then going on to the thing you'll really do with your life. And I'll just stop there.
Yeah. One of the things that I was reminded of when you were talking was, let's look at Cam Newton, quarterback now at Charlotte. Is that right? Carolina Panthers. And the role that his father played in his life and how he sort of shepherded him through the process. He took a lot of hits for it, no doubt, but he is now today in the NFL. And I wonder, what would that model look like if we had those individuals to provide a safe and nurturing environment to shepherd them through the pipeline to the professional sports industry? How would that look? If we see children who are really interested and they have the talent, how do we ensure that they get there? Somehow or the other. Archie Manning did it for his 2 sons. So what would that look like for Kwame from inner city Jackson, Mississippi, to ensure that he gets through college and then into the professional arena? How do we do that?
And I think that's an interesting point, and it's a great segue too. So obviously the comparison between Archie Manning and obviously Cam Newton. So when we look at those issues there that exist, can anybody comment on the fact of these stereotypes that are out there? And I think that plays into why individuals are being able to be thrust into certain roles or identities. Can somebody comment on that?
Well, just for point of clarification, though, Cam Newton's father came under extreme sanctions from the NCAA because he was able to negotiate $180,000 for his son's name rights while Cam was playing for Auburn. So you had this really interesting phenomenon happening at the time where Cam Newton is told by the NCAA what he can and cannot have on his body and on his uniform while he's playing for the NCAA. Meanwhile, Auburn has a $10.6 million contract with Under Armour that mandates that they have at least 16 corporate logos of Under Armour all over his suit while he's playing. So I mean, in terms of what we can do to kind of shepherd people like Cam Newton, legalize what his father did and make that appropriate would be one way. Because the comparisons between Cam Newton's father and Archie Manning to me just illustrate, you know, on the one hand you have an Archie Manning who has an absorbent amount of cultural, social, and economic capital that he can then use to shepherd his boys through the University of Mississippi and the University of Tennessee in a rather protective way, where Cam Newton's father is coming from much less and having to kind of figure out ways to negotiate around existing boundaries rather than working through them.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two pieces to the great question you asked, Dr. Northcutt. One is, and you know, Dr. Bartee, how do you institutionalize basically great mentoring, whether it's a parent or a coach? And I don't have a ready answer, but that, it seems to me, whatever answer there is means creating an institutional structure. It's wonderful if you have the parent who can be that person, or the coach, like when I talked about this fellow, Aaron White from University of Georgia, his mentor is one of their coaches, one of these great black assistant coaches who never got a head coaching job, even though he was well qualified, named John Eason. John Eason learned about being a man like that from Jake Gaither when he played for him at Florida A&M. And John Eason went on to get a doctorate in education, become a football coach, and he's mentored people like Aaron White. So that's a great coincidence, but it's a coincidence. The question is, how do you institutionalize it so it's there for everyone? And how do you institutionalize it when there's so much money, so much media out there seeking to undermine it at every time? Then on the stereotyping question, I think we saw this in the Super Bowl this year. There's still a rhetoric around black intellectual capacity in sports. In my book, when I read about James Harris becoming the first black quarterback to be able to stick at that position and regularly start in the NFL, the reason it took so long for that to happen is that quarterback was seen as the position you had to be smart to play. You had to be a leader to play, and you had to have a resilient, grace under pressure character. And in a racist society, blacks were not seen as being smart enough. They were seen as being people who should take orders, not give them. And they were seen as, quote, natural athletes, sort of animalistic, not with fully developed, characters. And even this year, Russell Wilson, this guy's 5'9", no matter what they list him at, 5'9" or 5'10", in his second year, playing a super complicated sport without the physical tools. There's no way you could be good enough on your physical tools at 5'10" in your second year. The only way he can win is that this is obviously a brilliant mind and a tremendous work ethic and a student of the game and a leader in those inchoate ways. But that was not how he was talked about. The rhetoric, the discourse leading into the Super Bowl, even this year, even in 2013/14, was Peyton Manning's work ethic and great study habits, Tom Brady's work ethic and great study habits. And I agree. I'm sure they have both of those things. But Russell Wilson has them too, but all you heard about him was, quote, his escapability. It goes back to an animal trait still in this day. And I think that is also part of the expectations you set of athletes. Name it and claim it. The way you describe someone begins to prescribe the role you're expecting them to play in the society.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that's a struggle, and you still have that underlying kind of racism that comes out, and it can be frustrating. I mean, you mentioned Tom Brady, and you look at Tom Brady, and there are times where he will come to the sideline and he will be extremely emotional. He will castigate his offensive lineman. On a personal level, he had relationships with 2 supermodels.
baby mamas.
Impregnated 2 women.
Right.
Okay, so now, but no real cloud of sexuality. None of, he just walked through it. No real. It was almost a pat on the back. Well, wow. I wish I could date 2 supermodels. It was like, this is what men want to do. What Tom Brady does. Who wants to be like no? So Richard Sherman has like 15 seconds of emotion. And all of this education that he has from Stanford, and the fact that he is articulate, and he has made one of the greatest plays in the history of professional football in the playoffs, relegate him back to a thug. And so, you know, it's very frustrating, I think. But on the other hand, for African Americans that have been in this country, there's a certain, unfortunately, there's a certain kind of mindset that you have that you have to keep your guard up, that you understand that at some point, the rules may change for you. And so you have to understand, is it fair? Absolutely not. So I don't think Richard Sherman was necessarily caught off guard by the criticism. I think he would have liked to have been treated a little bit differently and not been as criticized. But that's the reality, and unfortunately, hopefully we're going to get to a point to where those things become less.
No, just quickly, one other really good example involved Des Bryant of the Cowboys. So there's this game in middle of the season, and the Cowboys are in the process of, I think, blowing a big lead, and the TV cameras catch Des Bryant talking to Tony Romo on the sideline, really agitated, very animated. Everyone's assumption is here he is being insubordinate. Here's the capital A, capital B, capital M, angry black man, who doesn't know his place and is talking back to his quarterback and, demanding the ball and being petulant. And at the press conference afterwards, Tony Romo said, no, he's trying to inspire us. He's being a great teammate. I think a lot of people didn't believe that, thought Tony Romo was covering it. Well, luckily, they actually had either Bryant or Romo or the Cowboys bench mic'd for the broadcast that day, and they released the tape. And lo and behold, exactly what he was saying was, we can come back and get him. Let's win this game. We've got to win this game. He's being a great teammate, but he'd already been slotted in to a stereotype. And what made me think of it, Dr. Ross, is you're right. All these shots of, Tom Brady getting in the face of his lineman, that's seen as good leadership.
Yeah.
So total different racial construction.
Absolutely.
So how does this leak into the classroom? Obviously, you guys are professors at universities, and you have esteemed colleagues that have perceptions maybe about student athletes or about ethnic minorities. How do these perceptions and these stereotypes leak into the classroom setting on university campuses?
Well, I guess a number of ways they leak into the classroom setting. And one of the things that, for me personally, professionally, I am pretty rigorous when it comes to those kinds of things. When it comes to the presentation of self, when it comes to one's knowledge level, when it comes to being strategic about the decisions that are made. And so not failing to realize all of what we are talking about is real. It is fundamentally real. It plays out in different ways, but nonetheless, it is what it is. And so I seek to prepare those students who come in my room, be it if I happen to cross paths with athletes or non-athletes. I prepare them for the rigors of the expectations of what they will meet, how to navigate the academic pipeline, how to be deliberate about the decisions that they make in terms of the institutions that they attend, given their respective interests. And so I think it's really about preparation. We can't always change the process, but we can change the preparation in terms of having individuals at the level that they need to be at in order to meet those demands. And so that means attending particular kinds of programs. That means connecting with different kinds of people, and then allowing my set of experiences and my access to certain kinds of resources to be used as a way to move them forward in ways that I was moved forward. And so it's sort of like taking the baton and passing it back. And I can chart my pathway of where all of my students are. They are in Ivy Leagues, they're in Big Ten institutions. Right now, they're all on my cell phones. We talk at 3 o'clock in the morning to 3 o'clock in the afternoon because I am concerned. I understand what it takes to move them forward in whatever capacity. And so given that I've had that experience and given that others have had that experience, I think it's our responsibility to prepare individuals to be able to move through the pipeline, be it in sports, be it in education, be in whatever aspect of interest that they have to get whatever desires that they are seeking. So I think it's our responsibility.
So I'm going to give you a bit of a personal narrative here. So when I was a walk-on player for the University of Missouri, and in our off season, so spring, which is currently the off season for the football players here at this university as well, the NCAA mandates you can't put in more than 20 hours a week. That's the NCAA code, no more than 20 hours a week for team-related activities. So our coaching staff, and I'm sure that this is not an anomaly, had ways of making sure that you would go over your 20-hour-a-week effort. So we had required activities and highly recommended activities. And so your coach would say, okay, here's a list of everything that's going on today. These are the required meetings, and these are the highly recommended meetings. Well, coach, what's highly recommended mean? You want to play? Yeah, I want to play. Okay, then I highly recommend you show up to this meeting. We had a position coach who made it very clear to us in a team-wide meeting. He said, just so you know, you're a student athlete, which means you're a student first and an athlete second, okay? And when I added up the hours as a student athlete in the off season, so I was in the 6 a.m. weightlifting session, which went till about 7:30 in the morning. And then I had classes at 8, I had a class at 10, I had a class at noon. I was asked to be back once spring ball started. I needed to be back at the facility at 1:30. At 1:30, we'd get taped up. At 2 o'clock, we'd start position meetings. Then we'd have a defensive meeting at 2:30. We'd start warming up at 3. We'd be on the field at 3:30. From 3:30 to 5:30, that's practice time. From 5:30 to 6, you have one more position meeting. 6 to 6:30, you shower. 6:30 to 7:30, you eat. You get back to the dorms around 7:45 or 8. That's the off season. And so, as I think about, what are the things that we can do in the classroom, I recognize this in a lot of my student athletes in my classroom. They're just dog tired. I mean, they're working more hours a week than I do as someone who's paid, as a university professor who's required to do research and who's required to teach and who's required to do service. They put in as many, if not more, hours a week than I do in the off season. And so for me to kind of, rise to this sort of exceptional professor level where, I'm going to be the exceptional professor and make sure that, I follow them from point A all the way through point C. I'm not sure that I'm willing as an individual to put in the 80, the 90 hours a week required to do that. And I'm not sure that I think it's my responsibility to either. I think that's an institutional responsibility, and that I'll certainly advocate as their educator, and I'll certainly advocate on the behalf of student athletes for labor rights and work rights. And rights, as a college student athlete, but to kind of demand that of individual professors that somehow they need to set the standard and others need to follow, I think ignores kind of this big structural flaw that we have here, where this kind of, my experience isn't the only one. I'm sure I'm not the only student athlete that experienced, this kind of student work life issue, and that it kind of flies under the radar and people don't talk about it very much.
I think my question would then be, who is the institution? Institutions are made up of individuals. Without an individual, there's no institution. It's the same thing about bureaucracy. Yes, we have policies and procedures, but if you call the right person at the right time on the right day, that policy or procedure could be interpreted in a way for which will meet you where you need to be met right then. And so we have a spirit of interpretation, and then of course we have a strict interpretation. But if we think about has been one teacher in your lifetime who has provided you with some sense of words, some sense of direction, some sense of something that made all of the difference in your life. Just like we have that one, we have those who do not. And so while on one hand, it may not be our responsibility to have that sort of encouraging role of moving people through. On the same token, then, who will actually do it? Because when we're looking at graduation rates, they are pretty dismal for athletes completing college. And so if they are to have any kind of access or opportunity for success, somebody has to assume the responsibility. And I think it's definitely less complicated to say that the institutions is responsible for moving people through. On the same token, what is the role of the educator in seeing that those kinds of demands are met, particularly when we are the ones who understand the system in which they are existing?
I'll make a couple of points. One is that there's a program that's been in existence in New York State for decades called EOP, the Economic Opportunity Program. And what it says is anyone who's admitted to college to one of the new state university campuses from a low-income home, we recognize has probably had to work while going to school, has probably gone to a substandard high school, even if they are admitted to college, probably need some remediation. And instead of just saying, now you got in, you're on your own, they come up to the SUNY, that's the acronym, SUNY, the SUNY campuses for like 6 or 8 weeks of academic boot camp over the summer before they start their freshman year. And it's also about being socialized to going to college. Many of them are from homes where no one's been to college. They're from neighborhoods where few people have gone to college. And these programs have been very successful in achieving pretty much identical graduation rates and outcomes for the EOP students and the non-EOP students. Something like that ought to be mandatory for every scholarship athlete, because even if they're from a more affluent home, still the time management issues, the priority questions are around. But so starting with that would help. The other thing I'll say, look, I teach grad students. There's no undergrad journalism at Columbia, but I've had both male and female former varsity athletes in, some football players, a couple of rowers, including one who went to the Olympics. I've had people who are competitive professional dancers, which is very parallel. I think it's a physical profession that ends when you're, 25 years old, and all of your life has been about it from the time you're 6 years old. I've had gymnasts, and another parallel, we've recruited a lot of military veterans during the Iraq-Afghanistan period. And I think there's a lot of potential upside in athletes as students because they know what it is to sacrifice. They know from their sport what it is to work hard. They have to learn what it is to manage their time in terms of their sports time. And in a classroom, that gives you a lot actually to build on with them as students. But it also means creating, again, a paradigm in which they understand that what they're doing in the classroom is seen by the institution as equally important to what they're doing on the court or, in the crew boat or what they were doing when they were deployed in Iraq. But I think there's aspects of character and resilience and literally and metaphorically going through pain that can contribute to people having good academic outcomes as well. I've seen it.
The structural components of higher education, I think that's come out in the discussion, are not well suited to the structural components of competing at intercollegiate athletics. And I think and there's no reason, in my view, that the structure of higher education needs to get in the way of an education for athletes. In other words, working with athletes, we could identify what it is that athletes need to know, what they want to know, what their career or life objectives are, and what will lead them to that path, and what they need to accomplish to meet the requirements for a degree. But there's lots of different ways that those learning objectives could be met. And it's very unreasonable, I think, to expect college athletics or college athletes to compete. In which to compete, you have to go to the day-long meetings. It has to be the primary focus of their life, or at least that's what they're told, and then try to adjust to the structure of courses that are taught Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 8 a.m. And so at the least we could do, I think, is set up alternative structures where we identify what it is that individual athletes need to learn and provide them with the types of instruction that enable them to learn that, rather than put them in a situation where they're having to make trade-offs. Do I focus on this class and risk not being able to play, or do I play and fail this class? I think we force athletes into those types of decisions when there's absolutely no reason to.
Well, thank you guys for that. Let's move to some questions in the audience. Are there any questions for our panelists here about anything that's on your mind that you would like to discuss? See a hand right here, Joey.
We talked about post-secondary education, and y'all talked about some of the things that are happening there. But could somebody address that people with great upside in secondary schools aren't asked to perform academically as other people because they know that they're going to be able to go to college and they're not made to do the work that they're supposed to in 9th through 12th grade based on their athletic ability?
I think it's very true that in K-12, and I taught high school for 7 years and was a coach. I was on a football coaching staff and head wrestling coach, and I saw it all the time. Athletes were passed, and I was tripped up earlier when this topic came up because I'm not sure how that connects, except that it leads oftentimes to kids being unprepared for college once they get there.
Any more comments? Another question in the back?
I'm not really sure how to phrase it, but earlier in the conversation you were talking about how athletes are kind of paid labor, but you were focusing primarily on football. I mean, how would that affect women athletes or athletes in sports that don't bring in revenue? Because I'm on the cross country team, that sort of thing, where do they implement it? No one's going to pay for your run.
Right, and I think that's been one of the major criticisms when you start talking about athletes being compensated, but you can apply it the same way in terms of, say, women professional track athletes in comparison to LeBron James and all these guys in the National Basketball Association. Is that fair? No, but that's where the value system is. What maybe potentially can happen is that if these schools get to a point, I'm gonna do something differently as a historian. When these schools get to a point when they start having to compensate athletes, because it's probably coming, then if the athletes take the position that there should be a pool of money that should be distributed to all athletes, regardless of sport, then that may be a route. But what probably is going to happen is that you may have a disparity like you have now, because I think Northwestern University, those athletes have begun to talk about that they want to be recognized. They are putting pressure on the federal government to say, look, we want to be able to collective bargain. Collective bargaining is a right of people that are part of labor in the United States. And so they're going to make a judge make a decision on whether or not, as college athletes, are they actually labor. That's a very dangerous situation for the NCAA to put itself in, because they're going to have to come up with some kind of argument that they're students first. Well, you cannot take away the economic aspect that is being generated from these students. So any judge worth his or her salt that takes a look at the amount of data that's probably going to be put forth in terms of hot dogs sold, nachos sold, television sold,
Right.
tickets sold. It's going to now begin to pile up and say, look, these individuals are generating a tremendous amount of revenue. And so ideally, you would like maybe these athletes to take this as a totality, but I think what's going to happen is college football players are going to take the lead on this, because they're generating, unfortunately, the most amount of money when you start talking about college sports in the country, because football, in many ways, subsidizes the other sports on campus.
And it's already separated. I mean, you look at the University of Oklahoma suit when the NCAA filed these television lawsuits and they got control of basketball. The University of Oklahoma came in and said, no, we're a big football school, and we're not going to allow that to happen. So the big football schools have already separated themselves. You see now in the conference office structure, the Big Five now, the Big East, which is now the American Athletic Conference, is still following suit. I think they'll be included in that and be a part of and make it the Big Six again. But these conferences are already saying we want to do something different, and it's all because of football, television, all these things that are coming. It happens with football. If you look at the American Athletic Conference, which used to be the Big East, those basketball schools, they were trying to split in 2002 because they couldn't support that model of being basketball and people having football. So I think it's already separated. It's just a matter of how do we do that. And obviously the Title IX issue is something big that is going to have to be discussed, obviously, when you're looking at policies and procedures and changing law.
You know, there's an economist, Gary Becker, who he refers to the current kind of college system. He calls it a reverse Robin Hood scheme, where you have college athletics.
I heard that.
College athletics steals the market value of athletes who participate in sports where primarily you see a high concentration of poor and working class members, as well as a high concentration of racial and ethnic minority members. And the market value generated by those athletes is then taken from them to subsidize sports like swimming and hockey, for which even in secondary school, kind of to go back to your original question, these are sports that working class and poor student athletes, as well as student athletes who are predominantly racial and ethnic minorities, they don't have opportunities to play these sports and kind of cultivate these skills. So it's a really, really complex issue. I think it's also important because you had brought up Walter Byers earlier, and I too have a quote from Walter Byers that I wanted to make sure I shared everybody. This term student athlete, it's really important to kind of understand the context in which that term emerged. So Walter Byers was the first executive director of the NCAA, and he was the executive director of the NCAA for over 35 years. And so this is what he wrote in that same book about the use of student athlete. It was used to diminish any tendency to characterize them as employees. So he writes, the threat was the dreaded notion that NCAA athletes could be identified as employees by state industrial commissions and the courts. So to address this threat, we crafted the term student athlete. Soon it was embedded in all NCAA rules and interpretations as a mandated substitute for such words as players and athletes. We told publicists to speak of college teams, not football or basketball clubs, a word common to the pros. The NCAA adopted and mandated the term student athlete purposely to buttress the notion that such individuals should be considered students rather than employees. And then he later writes, amateurism is not a moral issue, it's an economic camouflage for monopoly practice. So just to give you more context and kind of history about that term, I think, which is really important in this conversation.
How you doing, Ronnie?
Can I be the next stage journalist here for the panel here?
Go ahead.
Here's the deal. I mean, it seems like we have a runway train here, and I don't know how you stop it. I mean, basically, the conference is designed multi-billion-dollar contracts. New networks are being created. The SEC network would be as an example to bring in even more money. So even if what you talked about earlier today about trying for the athletes gaining control and filing lawsuits and so forth to ask for their rights, it seems to me that the cat's out of the bag, and I don't know how they would go back and try to recapture some of the money that, frankly, I agree, I totally agree, they're totally entitled. But I just wonder if, when I see that ESPN has a multi-billion-dollar contract with the SEC, and I see that, I see that these other conferences are doing the same, are offering, trying to get them the same deal. I just wonder if it's too late for the athletes. And I just wonder, I mean, what's the answer? I mean, they would have to either be totally together in this fight. Or I don't know that you could have one school or two schools or three schools fight it while the rest of them are just satisfied with what they have. How do you stop this strain? How do you regain control?
Right. I don't think it's too late. I think that this is just the beginning. I've always felt, looking historically, that it takes time. There's a great book. If you want to know about labor in baseball, there's a book called Lords of the Realm. And in essence, it is a examination of Marvin Miller's education of baseball players. How he had to come in and meet with these guys. And it took him time to convince them that they had the right to negotiate with Augustus Busch, who ran the St. Louis Cardinals, with O'Malley, who ran the Brooklyn Dodgers. Because the idea was that these owners had, and I think your point of student athlete is very good. You're Roger Maris. You have a great job. You're a professional baseball player. You ought to be thankful that we're paying you to play baseball. You could be working in a steel mill, but hey, you're coming to the University of Mississippi. You get to play football on Saturday. You could be back in the Delta somewhere working in a factory. We're giving you a heck of a deal. What do you want? Well, that's one perspective. When the athlete begins to question and begins to really evaluate his worth, that becomes a very dangerous individual, because now that individual, the next step is that you can get these individuals to now decide that we will take the risk of challenging this system by not participating and using our labor. Now that is the next step, which is a very tough step for young people that are 18, 19 years old. It took several years for Marvin Miller to get individuals that were grown men to get to a point to where they could decide that they were union and they were going to negotiate, and they may even use this word of strike to strike fear, and eventually have arbitrators and to begin to now negotiate and have their own. But if you look at baseball players are making a ton of money, more so than any other sport in this country. You got people making $250 million over 25 years. That's a lot of money. But they paid a heavy price in terms of educating and realizing that they had this kind of worth. Until college athletes get to that point to where they decide that we're going to work together in unison, we understand, yeah, it's a privilege to come to college and have this opportunity to play football, but it's beyond that. There's a lot of money that is being made. Look around at what the coaches are making. Look around at what the SEC network is paying these schools. Look around at what every bowl game in this country is basically controlled by ESPN. We have about 30 bowl games. Fox has one of them. Maybe CBS has another one. The networks are making a ton of money off of college football. Everybody's making money, but these athletes. And to end, when you start talking about athletes in the classroom, 2 years ago, I had probably 7 of the most key players on our team in my class. The one conversation that got them not kind of droopy in the back or half listening or half taking notes was when we started talking about how much money college athletes ought to be paid. They gave a real specific understanding of how much money they make each month, whether they can go to McDonald's, how I got to kind of struggle with gas money, how I got to struggle with my rent. Right. Can I go home? I got to get my mama to send me some money. If I got 2 or 3 family members and they got issues, how do I juggle this little amount of money that I have? Okay, so these people are looking at coaches that are making $4 and $5, $6 million a year, right, and they are dealing with pennies. They dealing with maybe, I don't know, $800, $1,000 a month.
I guess that's my question. How far are we away from solidarity in the big programs that really can force this issue?
Once one school does it, once one set of athletes, you're going to have a Curt Flood. You're going to have someone that's going to go out there, they're going to sue, they're going to lose, they're going to take it, they're going to be sacrificed. But eventually what's going to happen is other individuals will follow. So these individual athletes at Northwestern, they may be the Curt Flood case. They may be the first case in which these athletes take this, and they may lose, they may be sacrificed, they may be ostracized. Their grant and aid scholarships may be taken. They may not get an opportunity to ever play again anywhere else in the country. But over the long haul, I would say, my prediction is in the next 10 to 15 years, you're going to see because it is the greatest business in the United States of America. What other business do you see where people are not paid? They're not paid. I mean, corporate America, people are paid. I'm paid as a professor.
Not
These
for profit,
athletes,
too.
huh? I mean, everybody's paid in this country for working. The athletes are the only ones that's not paid.
Let me just say, you already saw the example. And once again, it was the HBCUs.
Yeah.
Grambling's football team this year boycotted a game.
Big incident. Good point.
Boycotted a game, held out in solidarity. It was widely mischaracterized as them protesting Doug Williams being fired as head coach. And look, that was done in a very high-handed way. It was unjust to Doug Williams. There's rancor between him and Grambling's president, no doubt, but move that off to the side.
Yes.
The real issue here was educational funding inequality in the state of Louisiana. Right. When the players boycotted because their weight room was decrepit and unsanitary and people were getting staph infections, because they didn't even have basic items for their training table, Gatorade and muscle milk, because they had to ride the bus 1,500 miles in each direction to road games, and think about the class you miss as a result of that, rather than flying. What they were experiencing was the athletic department's portion of statewide budget cuts. Cuts made because Bobby Jindal turned down stimulus money because he'd rather stick his finger in President Obama's eye than help higher ed get through the Great Recession. And inequalities because Grambling's budget, state aid rather, fell 57% in 5 years. And inequalities because if you educate first in the family to go to college, you don't have a big endowment. Grambling's endowment is $5 million. That's about enough money to pay for 2 professors' salaries. LSU's endowment is $437 million, and that would be considered low for a major state university. University of Georgia, $800 million. For University of Florida, $1.1 billion. So think of a college with a $5 million endowment, and that's your rainy day fund. So what those players did was leverage the legacy and the tradition of Grambling football to draw attention to funding inequalities. And all the years that the budgets were being cut in Louisiana, and the president and other people at the university were having to lay off staff and shut down degree granting programs and postpone necessary maintenance to dorms and the library and other buildings and trying to get attention to it. No one paid attention. No one cared about that. When the football players leveraged their visibility, suddenly it was a national story. The New York Times ran an editorial about inequality in education funding in Louisiana because of what those players did. So even though the issue wasn't directly one of compensation to the players, the model has been set for a team acting in concert. So the other thing I'll just say, and now so well stated, Dr. Ross, is that as you describe what they went through in baseball to Marvin Miller, if you read labor history, go back to Walter Reuther and the steel workers or any union that's being formed. And there's always that education process that lets people who feel powerless and atomized or made to feel grateful for scraps from the master's table, there's always a process of educating them that collectively they have leverage.
Yes, over here.
I would simply note that there's a new documentary on Netflix called Schooled, The Price of College Sports, for some of you that have Netflix, that talks about a lot of this and also features a lot about Walter Byers, et cetera. So for more.
Schooled.
All right, thank you. Here in the front.
Yeah, so I want to shift gears a little bit. You talk about how a lot of young African-American men and young men in the country are sort of told that glory and money are in sports and they should be focusing on more academic things, being a professor, being a politician. I want to know what you make of 2 people, specifically Michael Strahan, who's now took his place of an old white Notre Dame grad on Live with Kelly. He's
Yeah.
old, right? And then the other person I really am interested to see what you take is Anson Carter. Less than 1% of NHL players are African American, and Anson recently signed a 5-year deal with something to be an analyst. So he not only was a vast minority, but he also made it to TV. So now he's got this post-NHL career in the public eye.
Strahan is an interesting personality. I don't know the dynamics. I still really don't understand the dynamics behind the show and the two personalities, because I believe Regis was on there before Strahan. Strahan has done a very good job in his post-football career of, I think, smiling, and even though he is was a dominating defensive player, large defensive lineman, he does not come off with this edge as though he has this kind of chip that you need to have to be this kind of dominating player that you would think you would need to be successful as he has been. So I think he's also, I think you have to give him credit. I think he's very articulate. I think he understands television, and one of the things that draws television is you have to have a certain amount of uniqueness that make people begin to connect with you. And I think that this large African-American man and this small white female, it works some kind of way. There's a segment of our population that tunes in and watches the two of them as they go through what they go through each morning for about an hour. I think that he does a good job of, they kind of joke back and forth, and I think that makes it work as well. In terms of the NHL player, I think I would look at that from the perspective that, African Americans have played hockey for a long time. Willie O'Ree all the back to the 1950s in the NHL, and you're probably going to see more of that as African Americans continue to, of course, be socialized in areas like Canada, where hockey is very popular. And so this opportunity that he's having, I think that's a positive thing, because now this maybe is going to open the door for other individuals to come in and not necessarily have this opportunity on the field, but be able to have this opportunity off the field. I'm waiting on, I like car racing, so when is we going to have another Wendell Scott? Wendell Scott was one of the most outstanding stock car racers in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So, I just saw Dale Earnhardt win the Daytona 500. Maybe there's going to be an African American that's going to be involved in stock car racing. So I think that diversity is a good thing. I think that maybe kind of is a segue back to what we started this conversation about.
We have time for one more question, and then we have to cut it off because we are at our time limit today, and we're actually past that. Yes.
I have one question about, you've talked a lot about the responsibility for a student athlete to handle or continue their education. You've talked about with professors and coaches and even athletic administrators, but as a student athlete, I think the majority of the responsibility is on the 18 to 23-year-old who's in school or even after that. And then my question with this is, I've seen student athletes struggle to be motivated to go to their tutors, go to their mentorships, go to class, not fall asleep in your class, Dr. Ross, or something like that. And my question is, if you start, compensating these athletes for their labor, how could they not think that they're, above this college education, that they're getting paid, that they're actually at a job? How do you keep the athletes motivated to continue their education if they're getting paid?
I think that's actually, I don't know if you're going to be able to actually, I don't know how effectively you're going to be able to do that. But on the other hand, what we have is a system in which we are bringing large numbers of student athletes on our campus that are not necessarily prepared for college. We are just patching classes together so that they can stay around 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, generate revenue, and then we will, for the most part, say, hey, we appreciate what you've been able to do. You try to figure out, navigate the next 50 years of your life, and if you can maybe somehow get back and finish your degree, great, but if not, that's a decision that you kind of got to make. So it's a very exploitive system. And I think for the student athlete, if you had an opportunity to come to school and be compensated and then you leave without a degree, I think that may be a better situation than coming to school and spending 3 or 4 years and not being compensated and not having a degree. So it's not a perfect, I don't think it's a perfect situation. And I agree with with your insight. I think that's a very good insight. I think that would be very difficult for professors maybe to deal with the athletes that are compensated, because you have the same situation that's taking place in pro football. Somebody making $100 million and you got a coach making $2 million. How do you talk to this particular player?
And speaking of motivation, well, one, in pro football, they have control to cut him or not.
That's true.
Based off of whatnot. But nonetheless, to your question, motivation is probably one of the greatest things that could be out there right now. And what we're seeing, and obviously me as a practitioner in athletics, I don't necessarily see the motivation being the same anyway. The motivation is, let's stay eligible so that we can continue to play. And it seems that, you know, these student athletes have the mindset to go pro and not to participate in any other activities outside of athletics. Obviously, time demands factor into that. Studies show student athletes are spending over 40 hours a week in sports-related activities. And you're talking about life skills. People don't have the skills to transition. So when you look at transition, how do I leave this particular game and get employment? Well, if you don't have time to do internships, you don't have time to be the best and the brightest person that these companies are trying to hire, you limit your opportunities anyway. So the motivation, if I'm a student athlete, and I was, if I'm spending over 40 hours a week doing this, putting my body through these rigors, doing these things, you darn right I want to go to the league. I want to go to the league. But the flip side of that is that if I'm not spending this other time doing X, Y, Z to put myself in position to be in a role outside of athletics, then obviously my concentration is not going to be on that. So I think motivation is key to trying to help these student athletes transition from sport to alternative careers on either side of the spectrum. So we as athletics administrators, we have to do a better job of limiting the time demands that these student athletes have. And that's a complex system. They're all conditional. We got alumni that we have to appease. We got a system that's put in place that is controlled by revenue right now. And going back to Dr. Ross's point, a balance definitely needs to be established. Well, thank you guys for coming to hear this great panel. They'll be here after to take any more questions that you have. But again, thank you. Let's give our panelists a hand.